Zach Zhang. I am the Director of Outreach at the George Washington chapter of the Alexander Hamilton Society, and this is the 4th event of our tech conference, which I'm tremendously excited for. And the topic of this afternoon is green machine, so thank you all for being here. Before we start, I'd like to go over some details. First and foremost, if you haven't done so already, please go to the check-in event, before outside the room after the event is finished, just so that we can keep count of who is showing up. And also, tonight we'll be having a question and answer session after the audience or after the speakers share their thoughts. So for the audience, please keep your questions in mind, and you will have the opportunity to ask them later. However, you should know that we are recording this session, and your questions and answers will also be recorded. Our session this afternoon is about an increasingly important topic in international affairs, that is sustainability. Sustainable development is a global issue that requires global solution. And in this increasingly polarized world, it seems to be one of the few issues that competing global powers can work together on. Secretary Blinken famously said on his policy administration speech on China policy that they're willing to work with Beijing on sustainability-related issues. And this is why I'm extremely excited to introduce our panel, whom we will have the pleasure of discussing this increasingly important issue with this afternoon. We have Dr. Ortung, who is a research professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs and the Elliott School's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. And he is also the director of research for Sustainable GW. He has extensive experience and expertise on the topic of comparative politics, Russia, Ukraine, and energy security. He's also a visiting fellow at the Center for Security Studies of the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Before GW, he also worked on Open Media Research Institute, East-West Institute, and a number of other research institutes. So he has a lot of experience with energy security, and especially the Russia-Ukraine question that we have right now. He's also made numerous publications in books and articles, and published in the media, New York Times, Washington Post, and Moscow Times. The other speaker for tonight is Dr. Nina Kelsey, who is a professor at Elliott School and GW's School of Public Policy as well. And her expertise is in international environmental negotiation, as well as international environmental policies and renewable energy policy, and the political economy of energy. Her recent publications include the sequencing to ratchet up climate policy stringency. I believe this is related to the Sustainable Development Goals as well, and also international ozone negotiations and the green spiral. Our moderator tonight is Mr. Colin O'Brien, a zero waste professional at the George Washington University Sustainable Center. And he manages a variety of zero waste initiatives, including composting, recycling, and has led a program for 2 years organizing GW students around sustainable issues. So we're all very lucky to hear from these speakers. And please give our speakers a big round of applause. And Mr. O'Brien, you're more than welcome to start your opening statement.
Sure. I'll keep my opening statement quick because my research is far less impressive than our folks here. I'm happy to be here filling in for the director of our Office of Sustainability, Josh Lasky. But I was a Elliott School student, class of 2020, so excited to be involved in this international affairs discussion. My work now is much more micro-focused on our campus rather than the global sphere, but as Zach mentioned, I work in zero waste at the university, trying to increase our composting, recycling, and reuse on campus. So I'm excited to join this discussion. Go ahead.
So, Nina, you and for
Hi there, folks. I guess I won't repeat my name, but as noted, I'm a professor at the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy here at the Elliott School, and that institute studies exactly what you would think it would study, given its name. So I, in particular, look at energy and environmental policy and politics, so that includes issue areas like international energy policy, international climate negotiations, the international ozone negotiations, and also I'm just really interested in how national level, state level, and city level climate policy relate to that stuff that's going on at that higher international level. So we were kind of told we could talk about whatever we wanted to in terms of introducing ourselves, and I'm going to try to keep it relatively short because I'd rather get to the questions. But I guess I would say that my perspective on this stuff tends to center around a few different points. First off, I tend to take a political economy lens, and that means that I'm interested in the politics of money, basically. So I'm interested in sort of who has economic power, what are their interests, what things are they trying to accomplish, when and how do interest groups successfully get what they want, particularly in cases that we might think of as punching above their weight. And I'm very, very interested in how interests, and particularly economic interests, change, either for good or for ill. So I think about things like, you know, when do industries and under what circumstances do industries become more tolerant of regulation or even pro-regulation when we're talking about something like a low-carbon energy transition. Or a specific example would be something like, you know, will the build-out of natural gas end up entrenching a natural gas industry constituency that would then resist further decarbonization down the line. So the other thing I would stress is fragmentation of interests. We have this big globalized supply chain for renewable energy, well, all kinds of energy, really. And that's a supply chain that spans many countries at this point. No country is an island, at least not metaphorically. And that has a bunch of implications for how we think about things like low carbon energy and energy industries. In particular, it means that it's very rarely the case that there's one policy that's good for all parts of industries in all countries. So, for instance, looking at the solar supply chain, right? Industry's policy that's good for solar manufacturers in a particular country might or might not be good for solar consumers in a particular country, like the people who might want to put solar panels on their roof. Industries nowadays are just rarely combined to one national border, and that means it's harder for governments to regulate industry. It's a lot easier in some ways to push support out than it is to sort of control or punish an industry. I will also note that I think about where innovation happens, right? So a lot of the basic innovation in things like renewable energy is happening in the developed world and in a couple of important rising powers like China and India. And that means a couple of things. First off, it means there's a number of different slices for the innovation project around low carbon energy transition. There's the developed world where we have long existing energy infrastructure and a particular set of needs and extremely high expectations for standard of living and reliability and things like that. So we need innovation that's around substituting and maintaining those things that we expect from energy. You've got the slice that I would center around the rising powers, places like China and India. Those countries need to keep pace with their rapid energy demand growth. They need to make existing systems more efficient and decarbonize manufacturing, which can be quite difficult, and they need to do all that without compromising economic growth. And then finally, we have less developed countries. These are countries that need typically extremely cheap energy technology, stuff that's suited to local conditions, which may vary a lot, and which allows them to build out new infrastructure to undeveloped areas, because a lot of less developed countries are not, for instance, fully electrified. So those are all different sets of needs, and they're not necessarily all equally well served by our existing innovation infrastructure. So we need an innovation process that puts boots on the ground in other countries and takes those things into account. I think we are near tipping points in both climate change itself and also low carbon energy innovation. So to some extent, it's a race between those two things, I think. So I'm going to stop there. That's kind of some of the things that I think about energy, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right, well, thank you. That was a great introduction, actually. And so I'll kind of position my own thinking, and then I was going to ask and answer a bunch of questions about what's going on in Europe. But so my career sort of began as a Russia expert, and I spent at least 25, 30 years, the number of years keeps growing, studying Russia. And about 10 years ago, I decided this is really depressing and I want to do something else. So I decided to get into the sustainability field, which is much more optimistic and exciting. But one common thread through my intellectual evolution was energy, because Russia is obviously a big energy power. That's where it has its real heft in the world. And energy is obviously key to having a sustainable lifestyle. And anything we do in the area of sustainability, the energy is going to be at the core of it. So, in terms of geographies, most of my early research was on Russia, but more recently I've been studying Sweden, and that's a much more pleasant place to go traveling in. The coffee is a lot better than it is in Russia. And it's relatively interesting in terms of some of this green energy, green machines that we'll be talking about this afternoon. So I thought I'd start just by laying out a few ideas on like where is the European energy sector heading in general? Like, what are the main trends? And then get a little bit into the war with Russia and Ukraine. But I think the overall trend that we're seeing is that Europe is trying to reduce its reliance on fossil fuels. And essentially the same thing is happening in this country. You know, over time we use less oil, we use less gas, we're increasingly using solar, wind, other powers. So that trend is quite apparent. But in Europe you can see different countries are pursuing different approaches to that same goal. So for example, Germany invested a lot of money in solar power and is trying to increase the amount of solar energy generated there, but it's still heavily reliant on Russian natural gas and oil. Sweden and Denmark are heavily invested in wind, and so when we were up in Sweden this summer in the far north, we went to Europe's largest wind farm, which was interesting to go with a bunch of students because there's like thousands and thousands of windmills out there, and it's quite interesting to see, you know, just see the scale of how much land it takes to have these windmills and how big these things are. But they're generating a considerable amount of energy, and in the future there'll be more offshore wind power in Scandinavia, so that's an interesting development to watch too. And then France, on the other hand, has invested heavily in nuclear power. So they're all the countries, and so that, you know, they get most of their electricity now from nuclear, and they're dealing with a lot of issues as a result of that. We could go into that a little bit as well. So different pathways, but to the same goal of reducing reliance on fossil fuels. And all these countries, of course, are increasing their use of electricity. So Sweden, for example, is planning a doubling in the use of electricity. And that means, you know, all the transportation, like the cars, are going to be electrified. Everything else is going to be electrified too, much of their industry and heavy industry. I think we're going to see that going on around the world too. And so hopefully, you know, here in Washington, we probably get a lot of our electricity from West Virginia, you know, some of it's from burning coal. But in the future, hopefully most of this will be generated from wind, solar, hydropower, those kinds of things. So moving away from the fossil fuels again. And then all this energy is going into new kinds of industry. And unfortunately for the world, these new industries require a lot of energy, right? So, you know, we're all on Facebook and Instagram, and some of us are on TikTok, and even fewer of us are on Be Real. But all that stuff requires data centers and backup, you know, to keep this internet going. And so in northern Sweden, Facebook recently opened its first data center. And it's good to have it there because you have a lot of hydroelectricity, so cheap green electricity, and you have a lot of cold air. Because a data center is basically, you know, 10,000 computers all running at the same time and blasting out huge amounts of heat. We were inside one of these buildings and it's like 150 degrees in there literally. And they just, you know, the job is to power the computers and then to suck out all the heat. And so some of that heat's actually being used to heat greenhouses and do agriculture in the far north. So hopefully the heat won't be wasted, but it's a clear energy suck. The other big thing they're doing in the north is green steel. So this, you know, the steel industry obviously is an old industry. It was heavily reliant on coal. For example, you take the iron ore, to turn the iron ore into steel, you'd use coal. But now they're switching over to hydrogen power. And so you're going to have green steel. So in the future, when you buy your electric BMW, it's going to be made completely from steel that has no carbon footprint, that it was mined without fossil fuels. You know, the iron ore was mined without fossil fuels. The steel was converted, the iron ore was converted to steel using hydrogen, which will hopefully be green hydrogen. And then, you know, it'll be processed in a way that the car will be produced without using fossil fuels, and then you'll drive it using green electricity. So you can drive happily and merrily along without a carbon footprint. So there's lots of other, big innovations going on in Europe too, just like here with, people really focused on cycling and riding their bikes to work and other places. And in terms of new building structures and making sure that the buildings are using less energy. So I think that's the other trend we're going to see is radical efforts at energy efficiency. So it's not just using green energy, but using less energy in general, even though the industry is going to be using a lot more energy. So just quickly, who are the winners and losers in this whole process? And so I think that the clear winners are countries like Sweden, which has a lot of capacity from its hydro and from its wind power to produce green energy. Obviously the people who manufacture all that equipment are going to be winning. Industries that can make the transition, like steel, because we're all going to need steel in the future regardless of what the economy looks like. And of course researchers developing this new technology, so the tech sector is really benefiting. The losers, of course, and this has already been obvious before the war, are countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia. They rely heavily on their energy sales. They don't have a lot of alternatives, and so I think they're going to be losing as the new industries start taking over. And many of the old industries, the interests that Nina was talking about, they're going to be blocking this transition to a green economy. So those old industries that don't have a place in the new world. And so we're going to have to figure out how to either reduce their power or compensate them for their losses. The other losers that we saw are people who have different uses for the land. So in northern Sweden, there's the indigenous people are called the Sami, and they like to herd their reindeer. So the more windmill farms you build, the more mines you build, the more railroads you build, the less land there is for herding reindeer. So that's kind of one of the main conflicts there. So just quickly to conclude, what does Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine mean for all this? And so I think there's sort of the bad news and the good news here. The bad news is, it's going to be very difficult in the short term. I think the price of energy has skyrocketed in Europe. Russia's going to be making a lot of excess profits from the oil and gas that it does sell. But over the long term, the EU is reducing its reliance on Russian oil and gas. And so the transition that was already underway anyways is probably being accelerated by this war. And so, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so hopefully the war will further accelerate this transition to green power and sort of cut Russia off from the money it's using from energy sales to support the war effort. But I think the key question, and probably something we can debate, is how quickly the EU can make this transition from fossil fuels to green energy. So how quickly they make the transition will really have a huge impact on how much power countries like Russia have on the world stage, and that'll be something to think about. So all these questions of energy and international politics and power are completely intertwined. So maybe we'll stop there and we can have some questions.
Sure, excellent. Well, thank you for that great overview, both of you. I think our first section of questions takes us back across the east on the Eurasian continent to discuss U.S. and China cooperation as well as competition in the sustainability sphere. So, Dr. Kelsey, in the context of rising anti-China sentiment in Congress here in the U.S., are there any promising new solar technologies that could provide an opportunity for U.S. and China cooperation?
Yeah, so we did get to see these questions in advance. And this was the one that I spent the most time thinking about. Because I think it's really important. The story of international climate cooperation has historically been about the relationship between China, the US, and Europe. Obviously, that's not the whole story, but that has tended to be the core triangle of interests that if you can get, certainly if you can get all three of those on board, you've got the heart of a solution. And if you lose one or more of them, you run into increasing trouble. But obviously, we're seeing two problematic trends from that perspective, right? So one is just that the relationship between China and the United States is getting more and more tense for some very understandable reasons, I think. But the other is that renewable energy is becoming a more and more strategically important technology. For a long time, when we looked at something like solar, it was a niche technology, and it did not really matter if our supply chains weren't all that solid for it. But as renewable energy moves more and more into the mainstream of our generation assets, we're going to have to start worrying about things like, is our supply of new solar panels or new batteries for storage secure? Because if we don't have a secure supply, it's going to be equivalent to not having a secure supply of, say, oil or natural gas. What we have seen is, because of China's ability to manufacture cheaply, and secondly, willingness to bear the environmental costs of rare earth mining, they have become the solar breadbasket of the world. They're the manufacturers of the vast majority of economically viable solar technology, and also a great deal of the wind technology out there. So, enough hedging, right? I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's going to be difficult to cooperate around solar for all of those reasons. I would actually suggest that it might make more sense to cooperate around some other things that are less strategically fraught. So there's actually a great paper that came out a little while back from Brookings that kind of categorized things on a 2x2 of like potential for cooperation versus risks involved in cooperating. So I'm cribbing from them a little bit, but partly because I liked what they had to say and I agreed with it. And the things I would pick out are things like CCS, carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and sequestration, people say both. I think that's something we're going to need from a keeping the Earth at a reasonable temperature perspective, and I think it's something that isn't going to be as strategically competitive, and that both countries could benefit from cooperation around. Batteries are another thing. China is going to end up manufacturing a lot of our batteries, so cooperation on that will be a good idea. High-speed rail is another one. I think that we could get some really interesting cooperation around, and certainly could use some learning from on our end. The technical standard setting for the kind of equipment that we need for things like the smart grid, but also for just ICT technology in general. That stuff is an enabler. It helps us build out our systems well and fast. And then just basic science of all kinds. Okay, that was probably the longest answer I'm going to give you. I'll try to keep it short.
No, that's great. And I think a follow-up to that is that you mentioned a few different technologies. Are there any specific technologies that the U.S. is well suited to focus on developing a competitive advantage in?
The U.S., it's interesting. Some countries sort of develop a specialty, and that's really never been the U.S.'s strategy. There are definitely things that we have been dominant in at various times, but I think the U.S.'s strength economically comes from being a really large economy and having a lot of diversification. So, yeah, I'd say we should be placing all of those bets and not trying to win at any one thing. But that having been said, I do think there are some things we do need to make sure that we keep track of. I think the world is going to, not just the US, but the world is going to have to grapple with rare earth mining, because rare earths, as many of you may know, they're not actually rare in the sense of only being found in a few places. They're rare in the sense that they are widely scattered but not densely aggregated anywhere. And they're rather nasty environmentally to mine. So we're going to have to figure out a way to get those rare earths that doesn't involve either A, allowing them to become strategically controlled by a small set of powers, particularly ones that might be hostile to whatever country is thinking about their strategy, but also B, that doesn't shove all of the nasty environmental consequences onto one country. So that's the thing. We just need to think in general about supply diversification, and that's one of the reasons why I think we should be putting our bets on lots of different things. That'll help us stay diverse. I think we do need to have our own capacity in batteries. Hydrogen is important. I think we should be getting back into nuclear, because right now China is getting back into nuclear in a big way, and I do think there's going to be a place for nuclear in low carbon transition. So the question is, do we just want to abandon that? I think not. Obviously, electric vehicles. We need to think hard about grid infrastructure, because that, again, is just a fundamental enabler for all of this stuff. If we can't put up, say, long-distance transmission, we're not going to be able to do renewable energy well. And then finally, and I cannot emphasize this enough, cybersecurity.
Excellent, thank you. And moving back towards our topic of Russia, Dr. Ortung, given the national security threat that Europe has faced as a result of reliance on Russian natural gas, as you mentioned, as well as a large number of climate refugees across sub-Saharan Africa, would you consider branding renewable energy and sustainability as national security issues?
Okay, well, this is a very interesting question, and I like the thrust of the question. I think it's a great question, but I would push back a little bit about the framing of the question, because I'm not sure it makes sense to securitize every single thing in the country. So energy is clearly important, and it's clearly important for our national security. But I wouldn't want to see like building a big military-industrial complex around energy. But I think we need to think about energy in terms of our security. And so what are the most vulnerable aspects of this system? And I think those are the very things that Nina named, actually. It's our national grid. We have 3 national grids, actually. One for the East Coast, one for the West Coast, and one for Texas. They have their own. It's our nuclear plants. It's the pipelines that we rely on for oil supplies, and it's the internet-enabled controllers that monitor and manage all this stuff for us nowadays. And so those are important from a security perspective, because those are the exact things that Putin is targeting in Ukraine. He's captured one of their nuclear, civilian nuclear power plants, which is the first time that's happened in an actual war situation. So, I mean, it's hard to imagine that happening on our national territory if some hostile, opponent comes and occupies one of our nuclear facilities, but nobody ever thought it would happen in Ukraine either. So, or, he saw Fukushima, obviously, where it was on the coast and it was affected by a tsunami. So, while nuclear, might in some senses make sense, there's definitely some downside. And we're seeing that in Ukraine for sure. I think our grid is also, Putin is bombing. He doesn't have access to high precision weapons, and he can't really control the narrative on the actual battlefield. So he's sending his rockets to destroy Ukraine's electric infrastructure, to make the civilians suffer, to make them cold as the winter months approach. So we need to think about what that means for our grid too. And then pipelines, we've seen in the past couple of years, the Russian hackers were able to take control of some of our pipelines and block movement of oil on the East Coast in this country. So that's also a clear vulnerability for us. So I think what the solution is, and I've seen this little bumper sticker in my neighborhood, is distributed energy is national security. So if every building were able to generate its own electricity, then we wouldn't have to worry about the grid. We wouldn't have to worry about nuclear power plants. We'd all have solar panels or wind or some other generating system. Like there's engineers at GW who are figuring out ways to generate hydropower from the waste that's being flushed out of the building. So there's probably lots of interesting and innovative things that we could do that would reduce our reliance on the infrastructure that could be targeted by an enemy. So I think, and that's where it's up to American innovation and diversity and all that other stuff, diversification that we have relied on in the past. So I think it's important to think about energy in terms of our national security, and then to think about ways that we can make the energy infrastructure less of a target. So more distributed, more green, and more resilient going forward. So happy to discuss all that in more questions.
So moving to that distributed model is a way for to reduce Russia's ability to use their energy as a tool to influence politics and action in Europe.
Right, right. So that's another interesting point. Just looking at it in Russia. So like, how would the development of green energy really neutralize the threat that's coming out of Russia in the European context? And I think that's important to think about, because Russia's budget depends about 25% of their state budget, and their import revenues are coming from energy sales. So that's, nothing in this room is made in Russia, but certainly some countries get a lot of energy from Russia. So even if we can cut our reliance on fossil fuels by 10 or 20%, that would reduce the demand, and that would obviously bring down the price, and that would reduce the revenues that countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia are getting. So anything we do in this space in terms of energy efficiency or switching away from fossil fuels is going to make a big difference, because right now our demand is so high, and particularly in the wartime circumstances of Europe today, the demand is much outpacing the supply, so obviously the prices go up. Anything we can do to cut that demand is going to be beneficial in terms of pricing, in terms of keeping people's houses warm, and other things like that. The other problem for Europe is that Germany's economy for a long time has depended on manufacturing and exporting those great machines that they produce in Germany to other countries, and that manufacturing sector has depended heavily on Russian energy, natural gas, being abundant and relatively cheap. So I think, and that kind of explains Germany's foreign policy toward Russia. They were often very friendly toward Russia, willing to cooperate with Putin and go along with some of what he was doing. But now, given the war situation, the German economy is going to go through a major transformation away from this kind of manufacturing that's dependent on Russian energy and really looking at something else. So I think that, the kind of atrocities that we're seeing Russia committing in Ukraine is going to really have a big impact on the way people think about their energy supplies at home.
So moving on to our topic of sustainable development, Professor Kelsey, some of your research has explored policy sequencing. Can you describe what policy sequencing is and how it can be applied to policies encouraging development of green tech?
So this idea of policy sequencing, which sometimes I also refer to as feedback or the green spiral, that's my term that I've coined. This is the idea that policy really gets made in multiple rounds, right? So you take one cut at trying to make a policy to get something done, and it's often the case. I mean, maybe you wipe the problem out in one round and you're done. But in something like climate, typically you need to start with one round of policy and go on for another round of policy and another round of policy and another round. And so this idea of sequencing or policy industry feedback is, how can you make sure that what you do in round number one makes it so that you can do more in round number two? It's just basically the idea that history matters and that we can think about that consciously. And so we can try to design policy, whatever we can get through in the sort of what's politically viable early on. We want to design that so that it makes more and more stringent things more politically viable in later rounds. So this means doing things like helping companies to adapt where they can adapt. Something I talk about a lot is the idea of convertible industries. These are industries that make a product that Bob earlier used the terms like winners and losers, and there are definitely some companies that don't have a ready adaptation pathway. But other companies make something that is polluting or that is high carbon, but they could make something that was not polluting or that was low carbon. So a perfect example of this is electric vehicles. If you are a big, a Ford, a GM, you quite reasonably want to harvest the economic value of the assets that you've created. So if you've got a big factory that makes cars, you want a regulatory framework that allows you to keep using that factory. But if you can be coaxed into building another big factory for electric vehicles, then suddenly you have an equally big incentive to defend that factory. That's a new valuable asset for you. And so we would expect that you become more interested in regulation that supports the use of those electric vehicles, whether it's emissions standards that sort of recognize the work that you've done in putting together factories like that, or whether it's government support for the build out of the infrastructure that will be required to power all of those EVs. Similarly, utilities, if you can get them to put in renewable energy assets, they then become more friendly to, again, a regulatory framework that prioritizes those assets. So That got long-winded. This is one of my sort of core research topics, so it's easy for me to get talking about it quite a while. So what does that mean? Yeah, like I say, I just think it means that we need to think about how the sequence in which we do policies can help us do later policies. An example of that is that concern that I mentioned about natural gas. Like, I think there's a lot of things to love about natural gas. And developments like liquefied natural gas, those could be a big thing in saving Europe's bacon now that they are rather suddenly cut off from Russian natural gas. But at the same time, in building all of that infrastructure, are we creating all of these sunk cost assets that people are really going to want to fight for down the line when we need to be transitioning away from natural gas because it has served its purpose as a bridge fuel? So that's the kind of thing. But on the other side of things, are there policies that we can be putting in place that will be rapidly growing constituencies that are adapted to the low energy policy framework and converting existing industries to them?
Excellent, thank you. And Professor Ortung, we'd love to open it up for you to talk a little bit about developing sustainability infrastructure in our developing countries and perhaps the role of the U.S. in assisting with that development.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I was thinking about this a little bit because, if you look at what the U.S. is spending, for example, in the war in Ukraine, I think the Congress has already allocated something like $13 billion to more weapons, to ammunition, to training, all that kind of stuff. So that's money that, $13 billion is not nothing by a long stretch, even for the U.S. government. And it's money that could have been spent here at home. It could have been developing infrastructure in places like Jackson, Mississippi, or in Detroit, where they don't have clean water. That money could have been used for a lot of things, and it could also have been spent on foreign aid. And so, obviously, it would be great if we could do everything, but that's not really feasible unless we just keep spending more money, which does seem like what the Congress is good at. But I think what we're going to see going forward is that this issue will be more and more on the agenda. And if we look forward to next month, there's going to be COP27, which is the UN Climate Change Conference. And this year, it'll be taking place in Egypt. And the whole point of doing that in Egypt is to really put the focus on Africa, the African continent, to put the focus on the global south, and to understand, what are the impacts of climate change for those countries. And also to put the blame on the northern rich countries that have been creating the problem. We're the ones that put out so many greenhouse gases that have been changing the nature of the climate, and they're the ones that are often having to pay the costs. With more floods and fires and other situations, including the refugee flows that we're starting to see coming up. So here, all the countries are going to go to that conference. They're all going to make a lot of good speeches. They're all going to commit themselves to doing a bunch of things. But if we look at the history of these conferences, obviously people promise to do a lot more than they actually do, and countries are no different. So we need to see what people are saying at this conference, and then we need to hold them accountable, because there's been a lot of pledges made about helping developing countries, but there hasn't been nearly as much action taken, in response to those words.
And Dr. Kelsey, we were talking about before this panel about local composting programs and that sort of thing. Do you think that there is a viable path towards meaningful carbon reduction at the local level, especially in the post-U.S. withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and during the Trump administration?
Yeah, the short answer to that is yes and no. By which I mean, any path to decarbonization has to go through local level action, because that's where the rubber hits the road. And as we have seen in things like the movement to city climate policy, for instance, as you mentioned after the Trump withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, cities and states and other subnational actors can be really important in sort of forging ahead. The way I often think about it is that the countries of the world, when they get together to decide their climate policy, they tend towards an average. And there's some variation there, obviously there are leaders and laggards, but there's a certain level of kind of an average that I think, at least if you're a climate activist, often feels a lot like mediocrity. Whereas at the smaller level, at the sub-state level, states, cities, towns, you can see much more wide variation. You see cities and towns that don't want to do anything, and you see cities and towns that are like, we're going to be carbon neutral in 20 years. You know, that there's just a lot of variety there, and I think you got to harness the leaders, because they can do a lot. They can help provide a backstop for when the countries themselves are not moving fast enough. They can pioneer things, they can figure out best practices. But it's still very helpful to have the national and the international level to help bring the places that don't want to do anything along. I think it's an ecosystem. I think you need stuff bubbling up at all levels.
And what about on the corporate level? Is there a place for companies to bypass their domestic governments and work towards developing green technology with the UN or other international bodies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously, this is a little bit of a fraught topic. I personally am a believer that companies can do useful things. I know not everyone is. But, you know, I think we exist in a interwoven tapestry of humans all doing stuff, producing things. We like the benefits of that. I like being able to get in my car and go places. I like having nice clothes and food from all over the world and all of those things, you know. So companies do things that we value, and they employ people like us. So I don't think it's useful to treat them as opponents. But I do think we have to recognize that they have their own incentive structures. So I do think there are companies that want to be leaders, just like there are towns and cities and nations that want to be leaders. And I think there are a lot of places for those companies to work with other bodies than necessarily their own national governments. So I definitely think they should be, making partnerships with, networks of cities that are working on things. I think they should be doing things like making their supply chains more transparent and putting in place ways to, figure out what the emissions involved in those supply chains are. I think they could be part of putting boots on the ground to help develop innovations and solutions that are not just suited to, say, the US or Japan, but are also suited to, Zimbabwe or Uruguay or the rest of the world that don't necessarily get to dominate the decision making around how we innovate.
Zach, are we even at time?
Yeah, we can start the Q&A session if you want right now. Okay. Well, we will now begin the Q&A session, and we ask that you please keep your question related to the topic, and please keep your questions short, as we want to accommodate as many questions as possible. And so any audience, if you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Francis. I'm a sophomore here at GW. And I'd like to ask, in terms of the national security risks of energy reliance, we see that Europe's over-reliance on natural gas created a national security risk in Europe. And similarly, the Biden administration's reliance on oil and gas from authoritarian regimes has put them in a national security risk. And considering the fact that in renewable energies you need lithium batteries and 90% of the materials are sourced from China, how would the US avoid the trap of in the future when transitioning to renewable energy, posing itself a national security risk due to being overly reliant to Chinese materials?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the students I've been working with wrote a paper on, are we just making a transition from being reliant on Russia and Saudi Arabia for fossil fuels to being reliant on China for rare earth metals? And is, which is better? Or is there any way to get out of this situation where we're simply reliant on authoritarian countries for, for energy supplies, which is the core of our economy? So I think the only answer here, I see, to get out of this conundrum is, like Nina was saying, thinking about how we can develop more of these rare earth metals and how we can develop new technology that we can generate the energy we need to have the kind of lifestyle that we want to have without being reliant on authoritarian countries. And I think that's kind of where the world's heading. Biden's been talking a lot about the free world versus the not free world and that sort of thing. And so I think, you know, maybe the idea of a liberal world economy was a mistake, that we shouldn't have allowed the authoritarian countries to get rich, thinking that if they became rich, they would become peaceful. That didn't work out, and that connection doesn't seem to be there. So it's up to us, and you know, being a believer in American science and technology and progress, that's where I would see the solution coming. So it's really, you know, I think in this case, I think it really is a technology solution. If we want to keep this kind of lifestyle that we have, that relies so heavily on energy consumption, then we need to figure out ways that we can produce that energy without these consequences. And so I think that's the key.
Yeah, I would agree. The one thing I would add is I want to be real clear. We're not outsourcing lithium production to China because China is the only place you can get lithium. We are outsourcing lithium production to China because China is the country that's willing to bear the environmental costs of the nasty side effects of lithium mining. We had lithium mines in the United States. We shut them down because they're not very nice to the surrounding area. And so we are reaching the limits of my expertise because I haven't looked into what work is being done, for instance, on whether lithium mining could become less environmentally nasty. But I just want to be clear, like, as we have in many cases, like for instance with plastics recycling, we're offsourcing the unpleasantness in that case.
Right. The other thing would be to think about ways to live that don't require so much energy. So if we all rode our bikes to work, and you know, there are ways of, or just, you know, simply planned our cities in ways that, you know, build our buildings so you can take advantage of solar power. Planned our cities so that we live near where we work, and we, you know, where there's theaters and other things nearby. So, you know, if you look at American cities, they're all, many of them, especially as you go farther west, they're designed around the car, and so, you know, very spread out. It's very hard to get around without having an automobile. So, you know, there's a million different things that we could do. Some of them are that's, you know, changing the way our cities are designed is a long-term solution. That's going to be 100 years before we can really see some progress there. But there's a million things that we can do, and it's not just simply that we're stuck relying on one or another authoritarian country. But have to start. I think that's the purpose of a university, is that, and where we really need to have more multidisciplinary thinking and education, where we can bring the engineers and the urban designers and the energy specialists and the international affairs folks and the other policymakers and the lawyers and the business people together to really think about these issues in a comprehensive way.
Any other questions for our panel? Go ahead.
I have a question regarding electric cars and getting the sort of the charging stations, the equivalent of the gas station. Do you see that it's kind of like a chicken and the egg approach, where we need people to have electric cars for it to be profitable for companies to start building these charging stations? Do you see that we need to move into, like, is there a regulation that we can do to sort of jumpstart this process where we can sort of like subsidize building these charging stations? Because I don't see the consumer buying into the idea of the electric car if there simply isn't going to be the infrastructure to support it. So does the state need to step in, or do we as the consumer, do we need to have some sort of education campaign where the consumer understands how like the importance of this? So I don't know, I guess this is just kind of a big existential question, and what do you guys think about it?
Yes. Which is to say, I think that there's absolutely a necessary role for government. It's kind of this is a classic, you know, even if you're an economist, when do you think the government should step in question. This is a coordination problem, right? Like, we all know that there is a future world in which there could be a wealth of EV charging stations and a wealth of actual EVs, and those would exist in a profitable ecosystem. But it's hard to get there. Nobody wants to be the person that takes the first step and puts in a EV charging station that isn't profitable because there aren't enough EVs yet, or buys an EV they can't drive because they don't have charging stations near them. So, you know, that's a sort of a classic government should step in there case, in my opinion. I feel like there was a second part to your question that I'm blanking on. I mean, education. Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to educate people. I think Last I heard, there were more people that wanted to buy EVs than there were EVs. So I think that's a combination of some supply chain issues on the side of the EVs themselves, but also high gas prices driving people to think, hey, maybe now's the time to make that jump. Maybe it's worth the potential slight inconvenience of not having as many charging stations as I want. But we also need to work on infrastructure at the house level, right? Making a grid that allows people to charge their cars easily at their house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just say, right, who needs the charging station is kind of a question, because, you know, with an electric car, you can actually fill it up at home, and that's what most people do. But most people in this case being people with garages and you know, a bigger house. So the people who would need a charging station are people who rent, who live in apartments, who don't have a garage where you park your car and plug it in, who don't have room for a charger and that kind of thing. So it becomes a very important equity issue. And so we would need to build, the charging stations would need to be built in the parts of town that have the fewest resources. So if we're talking about Washington DC, it'd be Ward 7 and Ward 8. So that if residents of those areas who typically live in apartments and are renting are going to benefit from this transition to, you know, eventually we're all going to be driving electric vehicles, right? Because the big American car manufacturers are not going to be making, you know, gasoline-powered cars in a few years. It's coming pretty quickly, actually. So, you know, not everyone can be like me. I have a 27-year-old Toyota Camry. It has 170,000 miles, and that thing's going to live forever. So I don't need an EV. But right. But it's these equity issues that really matter. And then, you know, it's going to be what is the how much do you drive your car? So most people don't drive up to 300 miles, which is the typical range of an EV now, in a single day. I mean, if you're going on a road trip, then you would need some charging stations throughout. But it's not really clear to me that we need that many charging stations around town. We need some, obviously. Like here at GW, there's plenty of charging stations in all of our garages, but they're just sitting there empty all day long because I don't think that they serve a purpose for most people, even the ones who have a Tesla or Bolt or something like that.
Although that does depend on the locality. Like in California, where you've got a higher saturation of EVs, you are more likely to see those charging stations filled. So it is partly that we're lagging here on having EVs.
Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know, my brother and I drove to Yosemite in his EV, and we were like very far from the nearest charging station. But it didn't matter because we were at the top of the hill, so we kind of cruised down and we generated electricity all the way down the hill. So by the time we got to the charging station, it was almost full again. So,
but I actually really like that you bring up the equity point, because that's absolutely true in terms of who tends to own EVs and who tends to own the kind of house that it's easy to charge an EV
right.
in. Another point, though, is just that EVs massively front load their total lifetime cost, right? So with a internal combustion engine, you can buy a cheap old beater car for, you know, $2,000, and then you may have to spend a lot of money over time on maintenance and gas.
Professor Ortung would know.
Yes.
Well, or you decide
I have a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles.
okay, you're beating me now.
I'm waiting. I'm going to get the EV next.
Obviously, professors need to get bigger salaries.
But point being is those kinds of high upfront cost deals are really hard for people with low incomes. We know this, right? A lot of times we will see people with low incomes losing money in the long term on all sorts of things because they can't assemble the lump sum that they would need to get the thing that will help them save money in the long term. And so they just live with the higher costs, which is unequitable in a variety of ways, right? And so that, I think there's definitely a case, particularly as EVs themselves become less expensive, helping, and therefore the lifetime savings that you can get from them become bigger, is helping people that find it harder to assemble that high upfront lump sum to do that.
I'd actually like to follow up on this and ask, you know, is the equitable, sustainable future every low-income person driving their own EV, or is it then taking an EV bus to work, or an EV or electric tram or train or light rail or something like that? You know, are EVs the climate savior that companies, you know, automobile companies, we've all seen Biden racing around in the electric F-150, you know, is that the climate savior that they would like us to believe it is?
I'll go first because I think Bob should have the last word on this one. I would say that I think the equitable thing here is that it should not be harder for a poor person to buy an EV than it is for a rich person to buy an EV. Separate from that, I think we should work on getting both rich and poor people to use less car, right? So we should have the kind of public transit systems that are, you know, running regularly, right? Studies have shown that show up and go is the break-even point for a lot of people. You've got to not have to think about scheduling when you show up at the station. You just got to know that if you show up at the station within 5 to 10 minutes, there will be, you know, a bus or a train or whatever it is that you use. And it's got to be, you know, a reasonably pleasant experience so that you don't feel like you're just miserable for an hour while you get to work. So I think we want a situation in which it makes sense for both rich and poor people to not drive their cars as much. But you know, the US is a very broad, low-density country for the most part, and so there are always going to be some people who need to drive cars.
Right. I mean, I think, you know, as we think about, I think getting away from cars is probably the key. And so electric vehicles probably not the main solution. But there's all kinds of other things like electric bikes and scooters and things like that. The problem, and like what you see in Scandinavia, which is what you don't see here, is that they're building bike paths that are separate from their roads and things like that. So, you know, like if I told my mom I wanted to get an electric scooter, she'd say, well, I don't think that's a good idea because you're not going to be safe on the streets. So, or you're going to get run over by somebody. So, you know, we need to make it safe so that the moms of the world can tell their children to go out and get an e-bike, and that they'll know that they're going to be riding in a place that's not near cars. It's you know, near pedestrians and other e-bikes and things like that. So it's a relatively safe environment. And so that requires rethinking the whole way the city is built and how we construct our roads and that sort of thing. So I think that's where we're kind of stuck now. We've maybe gone off on the wrong path with cars and need to go back 100 years and rethink how we do things and then figure out how we can transform our cities to make them more friendly to other kinds of transportation.
I was so confused the first time I visited Copenhagen in Denmark. They've got this system where there's the road where the cars drive, and then there's the bike road, which is twice as wide as the sidewalk, and then there's the sidewalk, and I didn't understand that at first, so I was walking in the bike area, and bikers kept whizzing by me and giving me dirty looks. I figured it out.
We got it in the system.
Are there any questions?
Yeah. So hi, my name is Fred. I'm a freshman in high school, and I'm from New Jersey. And so our state is one of the most vulnerable to climate change on the coast. And so my question has to do with scale. I think I forgot who, but someone said that states are like laboratories of democracy. In the fact that like you can have certain state policies, and if they work or if they don't work, that can be at the national level. But I wonder what your thoughts are about, you know, you emphasize the importance of local level and state level policies being more actionable than like in terms of like national or even international, where it's more difficult. But is there realistically, is there a translation between state level policy that may work in a certain state, but that leading to some sort of national level policy, or even like a national push for a certain policy, and that being effective? Is that something that you think would work? If not, what can be done for that?
That sounds like that's your department.
Gosh, it's hard to come up with a really, that's a good question. Because I do often, if particularly when my students are feeling a little bit pessimistic about US energy transition policy, I often remind them that a lot of energy policy in the US gets made at the state level. But it's hard to come up with so it's a really important question. Under what circumstances does that lead to bigger things, right? I would say, I think sequencing can be important, right? So this is obviously easiest if you are a big state, but California is kind of well known for the California effect, which is the idea that if California passes a regulation, a lot of manufacturers will just meet that regulation throughout the United States because California is a big enough market that it's just worth it to just make one kind of product that fits California. And so you know, California has been able to do things like provide real impetus for the development of renewable energy technology and electric vehicles. Unfortunately, that isn't a road that's open, or at least as open to, say, Rhode Island or Vermont. But I still think that any state, no matter its size, can help to develop best practices and test ideas. Because I do think that when a state can show that it's done a certain policy model that no one tried before, and it really worked, then other states do look at that. And even other cities look at that. And eventually, if enough states are doing it at the local level, it does eventually tend to percolate up to the national level as well.
It was Justice Louis Brandeis who said that states are laboratories of democracy. But yeah, but I agree. And I think obviously California has a big impact because it's by itself it's the world's fifth largest economy. But I think, I was looking at, for example, at where do these bans on plastic bags come from. And I think it was mostly from Massachusetts. It started in smaller states, and then people thought that was a good idea, and then it expanded elsewhere. So I do think that these states can work as laboratories of ideas, and if you come up with a good one, other people are gonna borrow it. So I think it does make sense, and certainly, it works for countries too. Like we see what everyone looks to see what the Scandinavian countries are up to these days, and if they come up with good solutions or bad solutions and things like that. So
well, and that's good for the Scandinavian countries too, right? Or any country that's doing this. I visited countries in Sweden. Cities in Sweden, small cities that were telling me they get delegations from like South Africa coming to see what they're doing in their city because they made a zero carbon commitment, and places from all around the world want to figure out how they're thinking they're going to meet that. So you can really get some positive attention by being a leader.
Probably every city is doing something right.
So on to the question.
Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm from an undergraduate from the engineering school. Just going back to your electric vehicle conversation, I read some things and heard some things that were on the negative side about solar panels, just because the price and the rare earth minerals that you were talking about before. So I was curious as to if you thought that solar panels had a future in the United States, or if you just thought they were going to be something alternative energy for the wealth because of their price.
I definitely think solar panels have a place. I do not think they're the be-all and end-all of renewable energy. I think we need to develop a lot of different types of energy. So, for instance, there are some places that have really great hydro resources, and they should be using those. Hydropower is a great type of power if you have the right conditions for it. Geothermal deserves a lot bigger look than it's currently getting. There's actually a lot of geothermal resources up in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, but the Pacific Northwest is also extremely well endowed with hydro resources, and those are a more conventional type of power, so the Pacific Northwest has largely been ignoring its geothermal resources because it doesn't need them. But if we had long distance transmission, we could be developing all of those resources and just sending some of it elsewhere. So, I definitely don't think solar is the only thing that matters, but yeah, there's definitely a place for solar. It does rely on batteries, and it does have its rare earth issues, but my sense would be that any analysis that's suggesting those are so big that we should just abandon the technology is probably not a good faith analysis. It's one thing to say there are some problems that we need to figure out how to solve, which is true. It's another to say, oh, there are problems, so we should just dump this. And that I wouldn't say is true.
I mean, also, a big chunk of it depends on the financing that you use to put the solar panels in place, because obviously they have a high startup cost, they're expensive to buy, but then over time, you get your money back as you don't have to pay for your electricity. So, if there's good financing models that give people the money up front so they can buy the panels and then get the benefits over time, that's really good. Places like Washington have solar for all, where the city is trying to make it feasible for all neighborhoods to, and all households to install solar, including people who rent in big apartment buildings. And there's other models like community solar, where you might have a vacant lot might be covered with solar panels, or a parking lot, or is it some other place that could be used for this. And then if we had the transmission, because GW gets 50% of its energy from a solar farm in North Carolina. And so we're not getting the same, electrons from there shipped over here, but, we find ways to work it out. But so there are all kinds of innovative solutions.
In California, I'm seeing more and more of the solar roofs for parking lots. Because it's just a great thing, particularly if you are in a very sunny, warm state like California. You want to park your car in the shade, and if the shade is a roof that's covered in solar panels, you can charge your car in the sun.
That's right, exactly.
Well, with that, I think we've reached, unfortunately, the end of our session. And I would want to thank everyone again for coming to our session and to our tech conference in as general. And I want to remind everyone that at 4:30, so a little bit back, we started the grad school fair, which is going to be in the second floor of the Elliott School. So everyone's more than welcome to attend that event as well. So I want to thank the speakers again and thank everyone for attending. Thank you.